The lonely lumberjack found the pregnant girl, digging a grave at dawn. The sound of metal against frozen earth cut through the dawn silence like a blade. Thomas Herrera stopped his axe mid-swing, muscles tensing beneath his wool shirt. Someone was digging a grave on his property, and the sun had barely begun to paint the mountains gold. He had lived 5 years in that cabin lost among the pines of the Sierra Madre Occidental, and he had never seen another human being so early. The cold March wind carried the metallic echo to his ears, mixed with something that chilled his blood, the broken sound of someone crying. With the caution of a man who had learned to survive on the frontier, Thomas approached through the trees. His leather boots barely grazed the pine needles as he advanced toward the clearing where the sound grew more intense. What he saw made him question everything he thought he knew about solitude and desperation. A young woman, barely 20, knelt beside a shallow grave. Her dark hair fell in tangled waves over her shoulders, and her simple cotton dress was stained with dirt and tears. But what struck Thomas like a punch to the gut was the pronounced curve of her belly beneath the fabric. She was pregnant, very pregnant, and digging a grave with her bare hands and a rusted shovel. The woman had not noticed his presence. She continued her desperate work, sobbing between gasps, her hands bleeding from the effort. The hole was barely 2 feet deep, but she persisted with the determination of someone who had no other choice. Thomas remained hidden behind an oak tree, his heart pounding. In 5 years of isolation, he had forgotten how to interact with people, especially women. He had come to the mountains to escape the world, to forget the pain of losing his family to typhoid fever back in Guadalajara. But here was someone who seemed to carry a pain even deeper than his own. The woman suddenly stopped digging and placed both hands on her swollen belly. A grimace of pain crossed her face, and she let out a low moan. Thomas realized with growing alarm that she was in labor, alone, digging a grave at dawn in the middle of nowhere. He could not remain hidden any longer. Thomas stepped out from behind the tree, his boots crunching on dry leaves. The woman spun around, her eyes wide with terror, the shovel raised like a weapon. She was beautiful, even in her desperate state, with features that spoke of indigenous heritage mixed with Spanish blood. But her eyes held a wildness that made Thomas stop in his tracks. "Please," she whispered, her voice hoarse from crying, "please, do not hurt me." Thomas raised his hands slowly, showing his empty palms. "I am not going to hurt you. My name is Thomas. This is my land." The woman's grip on the shovel tightened. "I am sorry. I did not know. I will leave." "Wait." Thomas took a careful step forward. "You cannot leave in your condition. You are about to give birth." The woman's defenses crumbled, and she collapsed to her knees beside the grave. "I know. That is why I am digging." The implication hit Thomas like a physical blow. She was digging a grave for her unborn child. The desperation in her voice, the resigned acceptance of tragedy, awakened something in him that he thought had died with his own family. "What is your name?" he asked gently. "Elena," she whispered. "Elena Morales." Thomas approached slowly, as if dealing with a wounded animal. "Elena, why do you think your baby will die?" Elena looked up at him with eyes that had seen too much suffering. "Because I am cursed. Because everyone I love dies. Because I have nowhere to go and no one to help me." Another contraction seized her, and she doubled over in pain. Thomas knew he had to act quickly. He knelt beside her, his large hands surprisingly gentle as he helped her to her feet. "Elena, listen to me. You are not cursed. You are about to bring life into this world, and I am going to help you." Elena looked at him with desperate hope. "You do not understand. I have no money, no family. The father—" She stopped, her face darkening. "The father is dead." Thomas felt a familiar pang of loss. "I understand more than you think. I lost my wife and daughter 5 years ago. I came here to die, but maybe I was meant to help you live." Elena studied his weathered face, seeing something there that made her trust him despite her fear. "Why would you help me?" "Because everyone deserves a chance at life, especially the innocent." Thomas helped Elena to his cabin, supporting her weight as another contraction racked her body. The cabin was sparse but clean, with a large stone fireplace and handmade furniture. He had built it to be his refuge from the world, but now it would serve as a sanctuary for new life. As Elena settled onto his bed, Thomas began preparing everything he could think of for the birth. He had helped deliver calves and foals, but never a human baby. His hands shook as he boiled water and gathered clean cloths. "Thomas!" Elena called out, her voice strained. "If something happens to me, promise me you will take care of the baby." Thomas looked at her with fierce determination. "Nothing is going to happen to you, I promise." But as the hours passed and Elena's labor intensified, Thomas began to understand why she had been digging a grave. She was weak, malnourished, and exhausted. Her body was struggling with the demands of childbirth, and there was no doctor for miles. Elena's story emerged in fragments between contractions. She had been married to a young vaquero named Miguel, who had been killed in a cattle raid 6 months earlier. His family had blamed her for his death, claiming she had brought bad luck. They had thrown her out with nothing but the clothes on her back. She had wandered from town to town, working where she could, sleeping in barns and abandoned buildings. As her pregnancy advanced, work became impossible to find. People looked at her with suspicion and judgment, unwilling to help an unmarried pregnant woman. "I came to these mountains to die," Elena whispered during a brief respite from the pain. "I thought if I could dig a grave deep enough, maybe God would have mercy on my baby and take us both quickly." Thomas squeezed her hand. "God brought you to me instead." As the sun reached its zenith, Elena's labor entered its final stages. Thomas found himself praying for the first time in years, asking for the strength to save both mother and child. He had become invested in their survival in a way that surprised him. The baby arrived just as the afternoon shadows began to lengthen. A healthy boy with strong lungs and his mother's dark eyes. Thomas cleaned and wrapped the infant while Elena watched with tears streaming down her face. "He is alive," she whispered in wonder. "He is really alive." Thomas placed the baby in Elena's arms, and for the first time in 5 years, he smiled with genuine joy. "He is perfect." Elena looked up at Thomas with gratitude that went beyond words. "I do not know how to thank you. You do not need to thank me. You have given me something I thought I had lost forever." "What is that?" "Purpose." Over the following days, Thomas cared for Elena and the baby with a tenderness that surprised them both. He had forgotten how to be gentle, how to care for others instead of just surviving. Elena slowly regained her strength, and the baby thrived under their combined attention. Elena named the boy Miguel after his father, but she began to call him Miguelito. Thomas found himself falling into the rhythms of family life, something he had never expected to experience again. As Elena recovered, she began to help around the cabin. She cooked meals with wild herbs and game that Thomas provided, mended his clothes, and brought a warmth to the space that had been missing for years. The baby's cries and laughter filled the silence that had once been Thomas's only companion. But as the weeks passed, Thomas began to worry about the future. Elena was strong and independent, and he knew she would eventually want to leave and build a life for herself and Miguelito. The thought filled him with a loneliness deeper than anything he had experienced in his years of isolation. One evening, as they sat by the fireplace with Miguelito sleeping between them, Elena broke the comfortable silence. "Thomas, I need to tell you something." Thomas felt his heart clench. "You are leaving." Elena looked at him with surprise. "I was going to ask if you would mind if we stayed." Thomas stared at her in disbelief. "You want to stay here? In the middle of nowhere, with a man you barely know?" Elena smiled, the first truly happy expression he had seen from her. "I want to stay here with the man who saved my life and my son's life, the man who gave me hope when I had none." Thomas felt tears welling up in his eyes. "Elena, you could have any life you wanted. You are young and beautiful and strong. You do not need to stay in these mountains with an old lumberjack." "You are not old," Elena said firmly. "You are 35, and you are not just a lumberjack. You are the kindest, most generous man I have ever known." Thomas reached over and took her hand. "I have been alone for so long that I forgot how to be part of a family. But these past weeks with you and Miguelito, it has been the happiest I have been in years." Elena squeezed his hand. "Then let us be a family, not because we have to, but because we want to." As winter gave way to spring, Thomas and Elena settled into their new life together. They were not married in the eyes of the law or the church, but they were bound by something deeper: mutual respect, shared purpose, and growing love. Thomas expanded the cabin, adding a room for Miguelito and improving the kitchen. Elena planted a garden and learned to preserve meat and vegetables for the long mountain winters. They worked together to build a life that was sustainable and fulfilling. The grave that Elena had been digging that dawn morning was filled in and planted with wildflowers. It became a reminder not of death and despair, but of the moment when two lost souls found each other and chose life over surrender. Thomas taught Elena to use an axe and handle the physical demands of mountain life. Elena taught Thomas to laugh again, to find joy in small moments, and to believe in the possibility of happiness. Miguelito grew strong and healthy, surrounded by the love of two people who had found purpose in caring for him. He took his first steps on the wooden floor of the cabin, spoke his first words in the mixture of Spanish and English that had become the language of their household. 1 year after that fateful dawn, Thomas and Elena stood together, watching Miguelito play in the wildflower patch that had once been a grave. The morning sun painted the mountains in shades of gold and pink, and the air was filled with the sounds of new life, birds singing, wind in the pines, and the laughter of a child. Elena leaned against Thomas's shoulder, her hand resting on her belly where another child was growing. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if you had not found me that morning?" Thomas wrapped his arms around her, feeling the completeness of a life he had never dared to hope for. "I try not to think about it. Some miracles are too frightening to contemplate." Elena smiled, watching their son chase butterflies among the flowers. "I was so certain that death was the only answer. I could not see any other way forward. Sometimes we have to dig graves for our old lives before we can build new ones," Thomas said quietly. Elena turned to look at him, seeing the wisdom that had been earned through loss and redemption. "You saved us, Thomas. You saved us both." Thomas shook his head. "You saved me too, Elena. I was just as lost as you were, just in a different way." As they stood there in the morning light, surrounded by the life they had built together, it was impossible to imagine that it had all begun with a woman digging a grave at dawn. But perhaps that was the most beautiful part of the story, how the darkest moments can become the foundation for the greatest joys. The mountains that had once been Thomas's refuge from the world had become the sanctuary where a family was born. The silence that had once been his only companion had been replaced by the sounds of love, laughter, and hope. And in the wildflower patch where Eleanor had once prepared to bury her dreams, new life bloomed eternal, a testament to the power of human connection and the possibility of redemption that exists in every dawn. The seasons turned, and their second child was born on a crisp October morning. A daughter they named Isabella, with her father's green eyes and her mother's determined spirit. Thomas held her for the first time with hands that trembled not from fear, but from overwhelming love. Elena watched him cradle their daughter, seeing the transformation that had taken place in the man who had once lived only to survive each day. The harsh lines around his eyes had softened, and his smile came easily now. He was no longer the broken hermit who had fled to the mountains to escape his pain. "She is beautiful," Thomas whispered, studying Isabella's tiny features. "She looks like you." Elena laughed softly. "She has your stubborn chin." Miguelito, now a curious toddler, climbed onto the bed to examine his new sister. He had grown into a bright, fearless child who knew every tree and stream on their mountain. Thomas had taught him to identify animal tracks and bird calls, while Elena had filled his head with stories and songs. "Baby," Miguelito announced solemnly, touching Isabella's cheek with one finger. "Yes, mijo," Elena said, kissing his forehead. "Your little sister." Thomas felt his heart expand with a joy so profound it was almost painful. 2 years ago he had been a man without purpose, marking time until death claimed him. Now he was a father to 2 children who would never know the loneliness that had nearly destroyed him. As Isabella nursed, Thomas and Elena talked quietly about the future. They had built a good life on the mountain, but they both knew that eventually their children would need more than the wilderness could provide. Schools, friends, opportunities to build lives of their own. "We do not have to decide today," Elena said, reading his thoughts. "We have time." Thomas nodded, but privately he had already begun making plans. He had saved every penny from the occasional sale of lumber to passing merchants. It was not much, but it would be enough to buy a small plot of land closer to civilization when the time came. That winter was the harshest they had experienced together. Snow fell early and deep, trapping them in the cabin for weeks at a time. But instead of the oppressive isolation Thomas had once endured, these months became a cocoon of warmth and intimacy. Eleanor taught the children Spanish songs while Thomas carved wooden toys by the fireplace. They told stories, played games, and discovered that happiness could be found in the simplest moments. The cabin that had once echoed with silence now rang with laughter and conversation. During one particularly fierce blizzard, Elena woke to find Thomas standing at the window, staring out at the swirling snow. She wrapped a shawl around her shoulders and joined him. "What are you thinking about?" she asked, slipping her hand into his. Thomas was quiet for a long moment. "I am thinking about the man I was when I first came here. How empty I felt. How certain I was that my life was over." Eleanor squeezed his hand. "That man brought you to exactly where you needed to be." "Do you really believe that? That everything happens for a reason?" Elena considered the question seriously. "I believe that sometimes terrible things happen for no reason at all. But I also believe that how we respond to those terrible things can lead us to places we never imagined." Thomas pulled her closer, breathing in the scent of her hair. "If Miguel had not died, if his family had not thrown you out, if you had not come to these mountains, we would never have found each other," Eleanor finished. "I know. It frightens me sometimes, how close we came to missing this." They stood together in the darkness, listening to the wind howl outside and the soft breathing of their children in the next room. The warmth of their love was a stark contrast to the cold wilderness beyond their walls. Spring arrived with a rush of melting snow and budding trees. Thomas began work on a larger cabin, one that would accommodate their growing family and provide space for Elena's weaving, which had become increasingly skillful. She had learned to create beautiful textiles from wool traded with passing merchants. As the weather warmed, they received their first visitors in almost a year. A family of settlers heading west had broken a wagon wheel and needed shelter while they made repairs. Thomas and Eleanor welcomed them without hesitation, sharing their food and offering their barn as shelter. The settler family was amazed by what they found on the mountain. They had expected to encounter a rough hermit, not a thriving family with a well-maintained homestead. The settler woman, Martha, was particularly impressed by Elena's weaving and the obvious happiness of the children. "You have built something beautiful here," Martha told Elena as they prepared dinner together. "I have never seen a more contented family." Elena smiled, watching Thomas show the settler men how to properly repair their wagon wheel. "We have been blessed." "How long have you been married?" Martha asked. Elena paused, realizing that she and Thomas had never actually married. They had simply chosen to be together, to build a life together, without the formal ceremony or legal documents. It had seemed unimportant compared to the deeper bond they shared. 3 years, Elena said finally, deciding that their anniversary should be marked from the dawn when Thomas found her digging a grave. That evening, after the settlers had moved on, Elena brought up the subject of marriage with Thomas. They were sitting on the porch, watching the sunset paint the mountains in shades of purple and gold. "Thomas, would you like to be married? Officially, I mean." Thomas looked at her with surprise. "Do you want to be married?" Elena considered the question. "I want our children to have your name. I want the world to know that we belong to each other." Thomas smiled, understanding her meaning. "Then we will be married. The next time a circuit preacher comes through these mountains, we will make it official." That opportunity came sooner than expected. A month later, a traveling preacher named Reverend McCullough arrived at their cabin, seeking shelter for the night. He was a kind man who had dedicated his life to bringing religious services to the isolated communities of the frontier. When Thomas and Elena explained their situation, Reverend McCullough was happy to perform the ceremony. He had seen many frontier families who had lived together for years before finding an opportunity to formalize their union. They were married at sunset, on a warm evening in June, with Miguelito and Isabella as their only witnesses. Elena wore a simple white dress she had sewn herself, and Thomas wore his best shirt and the boots he had cleaned until they shone. The ceremony was brief, but meaningful. As they exchanged vows, Thomas felt the last of his old pain fade away. He was no longer a man haunted by loss, but a husband and father with everything to live for. "You may kiss your bride," Reverend McCullough said with a smile. Thomas kissed Elena with all the love and gratitude he felt for the woman who had transformed his life. When they parted, both had tears in their eyes. "I love you, Elena Herrera," Thomas whispered. "I love you too, Thomas Herrera," Elena replied, tasting the newness of her married name. That night, after Reverend McCullough had continued on his journey, Thomas and Elena sat on their porch as a married couple. The mountains stretched endlessly before them, no longer a place of exile, but a kingdom they had built together. "Do you think we will stay here forever?" Elena asked, her head resting on Thomas's shoulder. Thomas considered the question. "I think we will stay until it is time to go. Our children will tell us when that time comes." Elena smiled, understanding that their future would be shaped by the needs of Miguelito and Isabella. For now, the mountain was paradise enough. As the years passed, their family grew and thrived. Thomas built a schoolhouse where Elena taught the children to read and write in both English and Spanish. She told them stories of their heritage, of the brave ancestors who had crossed oceans and deserts to build new lives. Miguelito grew into a strong, intelligent boy who could track deer through the forest and solve complex arithmetic problems with equal skill. Isabella was more artistic, spending hours drawing pictures of the wildlife around their home and helping her mother with increasingly complex weaving projects. Thomas expanded their homestead, adding a workshop where he crafted furniture and tools that were sought after by traders passing through the mountains. His reputation as a skilled craftsman spread, bringing customers from as far as Santa Fe. Elena's weaving became legendary in its own right. Her blankets and clothing were prized for their beauty and durability. She taught Isabella the traditional patterns passed down through generations of her family, ensuring that the knowledge would not be lost. The cabin that had once housed a single lonely man now bustled with activity. There were always projects underway, meals being prepared, children playing, and the sound of laughter echoing through the rooms. But perhaps the most remarkable change was in Thomas himself. The man who had once been so broken by loss that he had fled civilization had become a pillar of strength for his family. He had learned that love was not something to be feared because it could be lost, but something to be cherished because it made life worth living. One evening, as they celebrated Isabella's 5th birthday, Thomas looked around at his family and felt a profound sense of gratitude. Elena was teaching the children a traditional dance, her face glowing with happiness. Miguelito was attempting to keep up with his mother's steps while Isabella giggled at his efforts. This was the life he had never dared to dream of, a life built on love, trust, and the simple joy of being together. The grave that Elena had been digging that dawn morning 7 years ago had become the foundation for more happiness than either of them had thought possible. As the celebration wound down and the children were tucked into bed, Thomas and Elena walked hand in hand to the wildflower patch that marked the beginning of their story. The flowers bloomed more beautiful each year, fed by the rich soil and tended with love. "Do you ever regret it?" Thomas asked quietly. "Staying here with me instead of going back to the world?" Elena turned to face him, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "Thomas Herrera, you are my world. You and our children are everything I ever wanted and more than I ever hoped for." Thomas pulled her close, feeling the truth of her words in the warmth of her embrace. They had found something precious in these mountains, a love that had grown from desperation and bloomed into joy, a family that had been forged in the crucible of need and strengthened by years of shared purpose. The dawn that had brought them together had been dark and cold, filled with the sound of a woman digging a grave for dreams that seemed impossible. But every dawn since had been bright with possibility, warm with love, and filled with the laughter of children who would never know the loneliness that had once defined their parents' lives. As they stood in the wildflower patch, surrounded by the monuments to hope they had planted together, Thomas and Elena knew that their story was far from over. There would be challenges ahead, children to raise, decisions to make about their future, but they would face everything together, as they had from that first moment when a lonely lumberjack chose to help a desperate woman instead of walking away. The mountains that had witnessed their first meeting would continue to shelter their love, and the grave that had never been filled would forever remind them that sometimes the darkest moments are just the soil from which the most beautiful flowers grow.